Hello and welcome to Projector, and on this instalment, Thor is back and has to prevent Ragnarok in the latest entry in the Marvel Universe. When the goddess of death Hela, played by Cate Blanchett, is released and determined to take her place on Asgard's throne, Thor, played by Chris Hemsworth, and Loki, played by Tom Hiddleston, must work together to stop her. After they're catapulted out of the Bifrost, they end up stranded on the planet of Sakaar, where Thor is captured and forced to compete for the Grand Master, played by Jeff Goldblum, against his champion, the Hulk, aka Bruce Banner, played by Mark Ruffalo. Now Thor must enlist the aid of Banner and Valkyrie, played by Tessa Thompson, if he is to escape so he can return to Asgard and stop Hela's destruction that will cause Ragnarok. The Thor films have always been the most uneven of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, which is somewhat understandable considering that of the original set of Avengers characters, he's probably the most fantastical and certainly the most outlandish, and so that poses something of a challenge when you're trying to integrate him within the same world as, say, Iron Man, for example. And so how they handled that in the original Thor film was that they stripped him of his powers and they sent him off to Earth and they turned it essentially into a fish out of water comedy. And that way they humanised and grounded him. But at the same time, Kenneth Branagh and his team treated the actual Asgardian world with an almost Shakespearean sense of grandeur and reverence, clearly aware of the fact that obviously Marvel was setting up for future movies set in this world. The follow-up film, The Dark World, is often cited by many people as being the worst entry in the MCU, and I can understand that, but at the same time, I don't think that's a terrible movie. I think it's merely a watchable one, but very forgettable, although I think it really says something about the quality of the Marvel films that is considered to be their worst one. Thor Ragnarok boasts the series' third director, Taika Waititi, who brings a very different style to the material, which you completely understand given his background, given that he's a New Zealand indie comedy director, best known for What We Do in the Shadows and The Hunt for the Wilder People. And clearly, his thought behind the Thor mythos is that maybe instead of trying to downplay the weirdness and fancy of it, let's just lean into it. And the results are so spectacular that it makes you wish they'd approached this material in that direction in the first place. The Marvel films have endured some criticism of not having strong enough directorial voices behind the camera. The argument goes that because they play to the wide demands of the cinematic universe and they have to set up storylines and particular objects that will have significant influence over other installments, that takes more precedence than the individual films themselves and having particular voices attached to them. And to some extent, there are definitely MCU films that play into that. There are definitely MCU films that feel a bit generic and forgettable. Again, I'm pointing to Thor: The Dark World here. But looking over the MCU films, they've definitely chosen directors in certain instances that have brought their voices to their work, and you can definitely recognise them within the films. For example, you only have to look at Iron Man 3, which is definitely a Shane Black film. I know that's a very polarising movie, but because I like Black's work, I'm one of the fans of that film. I'd stick up for that movie. However, there's also the likes of, say, Guardians of the Galaxy, which is almost certainly James Gunn's baby. And in the case of Thor Ragnarok, it's definitely a Taika Waititi movie. It has his idiosyncratic sense of humour and really brings a sense of the offbeat to the proceedings that I really liked about it. You can tell right from the outset that this is very different in tone to the previous Thor films, but in a really good way. It feels like someone who is somewhat aware of the absurdity of what's happening on screen, but doesn't tip it over into full-blown parody, but just allows it to be bright and colourful and really fun. I think that this is probably one of the funniest Marvel films they've ever put out. I'm not just saying that in the way that a lot of people usually do with Marvel films, in that they do have quite humorous moments in them. There are scenes that are really incredibly funny in this film, and I think that's because What Waititi brings to the movie is a real kind of looseness to the film that hasn't been in previous Thor movies. A lot of the filming was improvised, and you can certainly see that on screen. You can tell that the actors are bouncing off each other. There's a really relaxed vibe to the film that can be directly attributed to Waititi's influence. He's always trying to find that oddball bit of humour, and as such, it really makes the film stand out. I think this, out of all the Thor films, has the strongest identity, and I think it finds something that those previous entries haven't before, and certainly makes it stand out among other big budget superhero movies. Waititi actually has a small role in this film in motion capture as an alien gladiator alongside Thor, and he almost embodies the characteristics of the film himself, in that he's this big rock-like fellow and he's fighting in death matches. But when you get to know him, he's quite chill, really. There's a big difference between this and the other Thor films in that this spends by far the least amount of time set on Earth. If you remember, the other Thor films very much divide their time between Earth and Asgard, and they had a whole set of human supporting characters, and the stakes were very much the destruction of the Earth. They have to stop the world from being destroyed. The movie has the confidence to not have a huge Earth presence in this entry. They go to Earth in the first act and then they leave, and everything else is set on Asgard or on the alien planet of Sakaar, and it helps the world feel bigger and larger in scope than simply having Earth being threatened in every single movie, and having the confidence in this material to not have human characters on Earth being used as audience surrogates. By that alone, Ragnarok stands apart from the other entries in the series, but the world of Sakaar in the movie is also really quite impressive, because it very much has this kind of retro vibe that I assume is a lot of Waititi's voice here going on, because it feels, in terms of its looks, like an 80s arcade system come to life. It feels like a video game world, and I mean that in the best possible way, because of course everything hinges upon these death matches. You've got these huge holographic video messages of Jeff Goldblum, and everything has this kind of Nintendo style look to it, especially in the Grandmaster's particular headquarters. And speaking of Jeff Goldblum, he is having the time of his life in this film. If you're a fan of Jeff Goldblum, this is perhaps one of the most Goldblum-y performances he's done in years. He really seems to be having the most fun out of anyone, and that really seems to be a competition because everyone seems to be enjoying themselves. It's really infectious on screen, but Goldblum, he is stealing the show with his performance every time he appears on screen, and he's technically playing the antagonist in that he's meant to be this cruel games master who's willingly pitting people to the death for his own amusement like a Roman emperor, but he doesn't play him as a traditionally evil character. He plays him like a charming Jeff Goldblum character that just wants to see them fight because he's so eccentric. But that isn't to say that Hemsworth isn't once again great as Thor. He really has always embodied the character so well, and across the Thor films we've really seen him progress and grow into the role just as much as the character has matured. If you remember all the way back in the first film, he was headstrong and he was fiery tempered and he had this huge ego. Those characteristics of Thor are still there. He's been humbled many times before, but he's still arrogant, he's still vain, he still wants to believe himself as being the strongest member of the Avengers. But even with that, he's always ever so likeable, and he's really, really funny. The Thor films have always leaned on Hemsworth's comedic talents just as much as his physical physical ones, and in this movie he really gets to show those off. This is meant to close off his arc for these films in that he's progressed enough that he can take charge as leader of Asgard and really come into his birthright. But if he's gonna do that, he needs to overcome being humbled once again. His trusty hammer Mjolnir gets destroyed very early on into the proceedings, and that leaves him in a very vulnerable position where he's bereft because he was using that as the source of much of his powers, and then he has his hair cut off and he feels completely emasculated. And so this is very much about Thor trying to rediscover himself, really find his true strength and powers, and this is of course displayed on screen in a not so subtle metaphor of him being able to command his thunderous powers through his body in a way that he hasn't done in the previous films, that he's used Mjolnir instead, and at the same time closing off the arc that Thor has in these movies in a really satisfying way. The Thor films have always had enormous casts, and Ragnarok does feel a little bit overcrowded purely because they had to bring back so many supporting players from the previous films, although it does help that Waititi is not exactly fussy about culling them. There are players from previous films that are brought back for maybe seconds on screen, which will probably inspire a little bit of fan backlash. As stated before, the human characters, particularly Natalie Portman's Jane, have been dropped from this instalment. In Jane's place, we have this new character played by Tessa Thompson, Valkyrie, who is a fellow Asgardian that Thor meets on Sakaar, someone that is very much on Thor's level, but she's not treated like she's a love interest. That's not the reason that she's crucial to the plot, and certainly she gets a number of standout moments. Even her introduction is really kind of impressive in that she wanders onto the scene and she's completely drunk, and yet she still manages to just completely obliterate a horde of scavengers in mere seconds. And she very much goes through the film with a sense of, I don't care about your situation, really trying to close herself off. But over the course of the movie, Thor tries to get her onto his side to aid and abet his escape, and you can clearly tell in Thompson's performance that underneath all that bravado that is very characteristic of any Asgardian really, there is pain underneath it that she's trying to keep guarded. Her responsibility to where she came from is something that she has to wrestle with through the course of the movie. Elsewhere, we have Mark Ruffalo as Bruce Banner and the Hulk once more in his first appearance since Age of Ultron, and it's established that he's remained in Hulk form since that time, and as such, there's a lot of callbacks to Age of Ultron in this movie, and in this film, They really kind of incorporate elements of the Planet Hulk storyline. But what I really found fascinating about the way that Hulk is portrayed in this movie is that because we first meet Hulk as the dominant personality, and there is quite a lot of screen time in the Hulk form before Ruffalo actually appears in person at roughly around the 70-minute mark or so. While a lot of the time Hulk is usually characterised as being Banner's flip side, that they're two sides of the same coin, that he's basically Banner's masculine id, run riots, taken physical form, there is that element to the movie, but because Hulk is so dominant and so much of a major presence in this film, what really stands him apart from previous incarnations of the character is that they actually feel like two separate characters in their own right this time. Hulk talks about Banner in the third person, like they're not in the same body. That's very interesting. I found that a very different take on that character that we hadn't necessarily seen before. And certainly there's a lot of great jokes about having Thor and Hulk interact with each other, naturally, because one of the best jokes in the Avengers movie was just that simple punch off screen, and the big battle scene between them feels very much like the culmination of what that set up all those movies ago. Going back to recurring players from previous Thor films, Tom Hiddleston is still having a ball of the time playing Loki. He's a bit more on the sidelines in this outing because he's quite cowardly and scheming, and as such trying to get into the Grandmaster's good books, and that is probably a better use of the character in this outing than in Thor the Dark World, which really tried to make him very prominent in the proceedings, really force his presence because of the fandom that he developed, and it didn't really fit with the story. It always felt like, oh, and then cut to what Loki's doing. In this movie, they satisfyingly resolve the sort of brotherly differences that him and Thor have been having. Elsewhere, we have Idris Elba as Heimdall once again, and this is probably the most substantial role he's had in any of these movies. I've always felt that Elba has been very underutilised playing this gatekeeper character, and clearly Elba wanted a much meatier part. His role is quite pivotal, but it takes a fairly long time for him to reappear on the scene. It's probably a good hour before Heimdall comes back into the proceedings, because at the beginning of the film he's still in hiding after the events of what happened in the Dark World, where he helped Thor commit treason. Speaking of which, Anthony Hopkins is back once again as Odin in somewhat diminished capacity. He only has a handful of scenes in this film. However, I think he's far more engaged in his fairly small appearance in this film than he was in Thor the Dark World, where he seemed to be phoning in and be really bored with the movie. Here he seems really quite engaged, and again getting into the fun of the proceedings, especially in an early scene where he's playing Loki playing Odin and getting to do things that are quite out of character and doing things that he hasn't been able to do in these movies. You can clearly tell that he's really enjoying playing that scene. I think that's probably Hopkins' standout moment, but he plays a quite pivotal role in the proceedings still, but it's a much smaller role than in the other entries. Which brings us to our villains, and I think that Marvel's been having a really good year when it comes to its antagonists. I've often criticised their villains for being under-characterised and only really there for someone to have the heroes to fight up against, but you certainly couldn't level that criticism at Kurt Russell in Guardians or Michael Keaton in Spider-Man. I thought they really left their marks on those movies and were developed interesting characters in their own right. It's a bit of a shame then that Cate Blanchett doesn't quite make it a hat-trick. Now don't get me wrong, she really bites into this part and plays it with scenery chewing gusto. It's very much in the same sort of vein as her role in Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. And she is deriving a lot of pleasure out of playing this scorned, power-hungry woman, and you completely understand her motivation given that she's been snuffed out of Asgard's legacy that she's played a key role in, and she's just reclaiming what she believes is hers. She makes a big splash with her introduction, but after that she gets moved into the background for most of the middle act, because of course most of the main characters are on Sakaar, not Asgard, so we only cut back to Asgard intermittently as she establishes a tyrannical rule, which really diminishes her power. She's meant to be so powerful that Thor cannot defeat her by himself, but you don't really get the sense of her presence because the film spends so much time away from her. There are actually long stretches where Blanchett is not on screen whatsoever, and so that really undermines her portrayal, even though once we do come back to her towards the end of the film, she's still great, but it's the very story that the film is telling that kind of undoes this character, unfortunately. And she spends most of the film alongside Karl Urban, who is the new commander of the Bifrost in place of Heimdall. Urban's adopted this accent that sounds vaguely like Ray Winston, and he's really funny. And then the character kind of gets pushed into being an underling of Hela. The character's got this sort of conflicted relationship because he's only really allied with her to save his own skin. But I wish they'd done a little bit more with that character and done a little bit more with Urban. Again, there'll probably be some divisive opinions about Waitiki's humour and the tone of the film, especially because there's some quite dark things playing in the background here, especially the enslavement of the Asgardian people that becomes increasingly clear as the film moves towards its climax. But really, I thought that the way the film handled itself with a fairly light touch was fairly refreshing. It resisted the urge that many superhero films have of becoming very grim, dark, and self-serious. And I have to admit that in spite of some of the issues that I had with the overpopulated cast, I do have to say that I really enjoyed myself at this movie. This is probably some of the most fun I've had at the movies all year. It's really funny, really a pleasant surprise, and feels, again, quite distinct within the Marvel universe. It satisfies in doing all those things that the Marvel films are supposed to do in setting up for future installments, but still does its own thing. And I think it shows that the two aren't mutually exclusive. Thor Ragnarok is easily the best entry in the Thor films and one of the most relentlessly entertaining in the whole Marvel collection. While Marvel films can sometimes feel anonymous, Taika Waititi's voice and especially humour can be felt all throughout this film, making this easily one of the most consistently funny films in the franchise, even with a fairly dark story playing in the background. Some will argue it may be too much, but Waititi brings an energy and surreal absurdity that's very welcome and surprising. Although the film is somewhat overcrowded, the main cast seem to be having the time of their lives, especially Goldblum and Hemsworth, although Blanchett's enthusiasm is marred by being sidelined for most of the flick in yet another example of Marvel's undercooked villains. Overall though, it's sheer fantastic fun that delivers the big set pieces you'd expect, but also some even bigger laughs. If you like this review, then thunder over to my Patreon, where you can see my reviews early among other perks. But until next time, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.